book launch for the volume Imperial Inequalities, the politics of economic governance across European empires. We are currently live streaming, bear that in mind, and the camera will wrap around the room to look at whoever is speaking. My name is Mira Sabaratnam. I have the privilege of being one of the series editors of the Postcolonial International Studies series at Manchester University Press, where this volume kindly agreed to be cited. It was coming together at the same time as our series was being launched, and we are absolutely delighted. I'm going to hold it up. We are absolutely delighted to welcome this. It's exactly the kind of scholarship that we aim to publish in the series, which is about the colonial dimensions of the international. And this volume probes it in really excellent searching ways, drawing out not just continuities, but evolutions and tensions and frictions within that process. I'm not going to say much more about the volume other than it's absolutely fantastic and you should all get and read it. I've read all of it now and it's just brilliant, and I've spent all of my time having ideas and writing notes, and I think you will too. So I'm going to introduce the series editor, or the book editor, one of the book editors, Gurminder K. Bambra, as if you don't know, is Professor of Postcolonial and Decolonial Studies here at the University of Sussex. Gurminder, go ahead.
Thank you. I mean, thank you all so much for coming. It's great to have an in-person event after a number of years. And the book itself started just before COVID, and then COVID happened and we never meet in person. So this is the first time that as contributors, we're all actually meeting in person. So that's a really nice thing as well. So hello also to all of those listening on live stream. I hope the audio is working and all of that sort of stuff. What I want to do in the opening comments, Julia, who's the co-editor of the book, will sort of introduce the book more in a moment, but I just wanted to set out some opening comments to sort of say a little bit about why I think these themes matter and how we might be able to open up a conversation in terms of the insights that are within the book, in terms of thinking about the shape of progressive politics in the present. So even though many of the chapters in the book are historically based, I think they're all speaking to very current themes, and particularly around questions of national redistribution, how we take into account colonial histories, and perhaps how we might sort of more systematically think about the issue of global redistribution, framed now as reparations. Where I'll start is with the idea that much of the standard literature on inequality, and especially on global inequality, and here I'm thinking of people like Branko Milanovic, Thomas Piketty, and others, that what they do is really, they fail to adequately account for how global inequality has actually come about. They tend to take the nation as the methodological unit of analysis, and they look at inequality between nations. And yet the countries that they present as nations weren't necessarily independent, autonomous nations at the time that they're talking about. So for example, both Piketty and Milanovic compare the economies of Britain and India over 200 years. But for 150 of those 200 years, India was a colony subsumed to the economy of Britain. So what does it mean to compare the two economies as if they were two independent units, when actually there's a different political and economic relationship between them? And my argument has been always that if we don't take colonial histories into account, what we do is distort the possibility of analyses in the present, and particularly through into the present. So the focus of the research that I've done recently that's here in this book is around the welfare state. And I'm interested in how the welfare state came into being in Britain, and to think about, what were the justifications of the welfare state at the time and arguments in the present. One explicit justification at the time was that the welfare state was needed in order to compensate the population, both who'd been on the front line and in the home front, for the sacrifices that they'd made during the two world wars. And this was an explicit sort of issue of recompense for them. Asa Briggs, who was a historian, and also for those of you locally, he was a former Vice Chancellor of Sussex, he stated that it was the shared experience of total war that forced politicians to consider the community as a whole and to deploy communal resources to abate poverty and to assist those in distress. So in this way, warfare and welfare were conjoined in bringing together the idea of citizens as a nation, and this was reinforced through processes by way of which material resources were to be redistributed through national boundaries. But there's a problem, because the wars weren't fought by the British nation. The wars were fought by the British Empire. And during the First World War, for example, 1 million Indian soldiers served overseas and over 2 million fought for the Allies in the Second World War. The wars were also significantly funded by the colonial populations, with India basically being a financial reservoir for both wars. During the Second World War, for example, alongside the increase in military expenditure that was attributed to the Indian budget, India further supported the British war effort through a series of forced loans that provided goods and services to the British in return for IOUs, that is, in return for sterling balances. Now, in earlier discussions about how the war was to be funded, Keynes had argued that one option was to let prices rise more than real wages. This would redistribute incomes away from wages to profits, which could then be taxed in order to pay for the war. Such a scheme, however, would disproportionately affect the poorest in society, and in order to ensure domestic working class support for the war, it was disregarded in favour of a system of graded taxation. But the scheme that was deemed to be too regressive for implementation in Britain, as Patnaik has set out, was implemented in India upon a colonised population which had a significantly lower per head income. This policy of deliberately produced inflation led directly to the deaths of over 3 million civilians in the Bengal famine in 1943. I could talk much more about this. I'm really happy to pick up questions on this, but I want to get back to the welfare state. So Britain emerges from the Second World War committed to the construction of the welfare state. But how this was to be paid for was a real issue, because in the immediate post-war period, the government faced significant economic difficulties. There was a lack of material resources, a lack of productive capacity, and there was not much financial resource. Britain in particular owed £3 billion at the time to its creditors. So how was this to be paid for? The short answer is by turning to empire. First, after independence, Britain had owed India and Pakistan around $1.3 billion. It reduced that amount by at least a third through various processes, and so didn't pay the amount that it had owed. Secondly, it subordinated the economies of its remaining colonies to national concerns. So money that could have been used for their own development was forcibly appropriated, and it was used to fund the development of the welfare state in Britain. The colonial dividend that Britain had enjoyed during the height of empire continued even after the beginnings of decolonisation and was integral to the construction of the post-war welfare state. You may have seen Daily Mail headlines talking recently about how people don't pay in much to the welfare state but get a lot out of it. But one of the things, and I'm not, we can discuss that as well, but there is a thing that if we look historically, the national population has always received much more in terms of welfare than it has ever contributed in terms of taxation. And I'll set that, so Winston Churchill, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1929, and he stated, and here there's a quote, "The income which we derive each year from commission and services rendered to foreign countries is over 65 million. In addition, we have a steady revenue of foreign investments of close on 300 million a year. This is the explanation of the source from which we are able to defray social services at a level incomparably higher than that of any European country. These overseas resources constitute the keystone of our economic position." These resources from overseas included the taxes paid by colonial populations, as well as the interest that they paid on loans, which had been taken out by British entrepreneurs for investments elsewhere. As Richard Templet noted in his earlier 1884 presentation on the general statistics of the British Empire, of half the money that was at the disposal of the British state, more than half of that money came from India and other territories and colonies in the rest of empire. So this colonial income was used to provide welfare and other public goods for national citizens, but was never available for colonized ones. And it's this asymmetry that I argue we need to account for within current debates on the welfare state. On both the right and the left, there's a presentation of the welfare state as a national project. I mean, one need only think of Ken Loach's Spirit 45 film, for example. And there's a presentation of it as somehow being under threat from outsiders. From Suella Braverman's recent comments blaming the collapse of the NHS on what she terms illegal immigrants, to the former leftist Wolfgang Street warning against immigrant invaders undermining the very foundations of the welfare state. On both left and right, there is very little acknowledgement of the contribution of outsiders in enabling the very structures of the welfare state that is otherwise to be protected from them. So this project of Imperial Inequalities starts from that explicit provocation to consider how what is presented as national was actually colonial in origin, and how in acknowledging this, we might be able to begin imagining a politics that is inclusive and generous rather than exclusionary and exterminative.
Thank you, Govinda. I'd now like to invite Julia McClure, Senior Lecturer in Late Medieval and Early Modern Global History at the University of Glasgow, to make up some more about the age of modern.
Excellent, thank you so much. And yes, it's great to see people in person finally after all these meetings we've had online. So thank you everyone for being here today, here and online, to celebrate the launch of this volume. So this volume came out of critical conversation between academics and practitioners in tax justice, that was facilitated by an event hosted by the Tax Justice Network. Thank you very much. Then in December 2020. And I believe that recording of the event is still available online for anyone who's interested in following up on that conversation. I would argue that Imperial Inequalities, our new volume, is a landmark volume that's an open call to arms to focus upon the active role that taxation regimes have played and continue to play in creating inequalities both within and between nations. The chapters in this volume focus on the politics of economic governance and set out how imperial policies and ideologies created path dependencies, the regressive taxation regimes and cartographies of tax havens that help structure and sustain today's global inequalities. It used historical analysis to demonstrate the ways in which nations and empires were co-constitutive units, and uses this to place the ongoing need for tax justice at the heart of the ongoing project of decolonisation. The volume used the term imperial inequalities to crystallise the understanding of the role empires have played in hardwiring today's inequalities. So the volume, and I see there's some in the room for those who are interested, and there's flyers on the table as well, doing the sales pitch now for the volume. It's organised into 3 sections. The first section, Fiscal Strategies, Institutional Innovations, offers chapters which examine the meaning of colonial financial economy and the rights of sovereign seizure, the ways in which taxation shaped imperial projects and the development of fiscal capacity in the broader empires. The second section, Taxation and Welfare, explores the ways in which beneficiaries of imperial extraction justified wealth inequalities, using notions of the common good, spiritual economy of charity, or welfare provision. All of these notions were informed variously by humanistic ideals of political community, religious ideals of obligation and return, and theories of morality or civilization. The final section, Post-Colonial Legacies, explores the legacies of imperial inequalities that were created through the unequal colonial taxation regimes and the ways in which these shape contemporary economic practices with tax havens and the ongoing influence of former colonizers in the shape of redistributive regimes in nominally post-colonial countries. So the volume has 15 chapters with a broad chronological and geographical range, with chapters from Spanish colonialism in the Americas in the 16th century, English colonialism in Ireland in the 17th century, to French, British and Dutch colonialism in Africa, the Caribbean, India and Indonesia in the 19th, 20th century. So you see, we have kind of put together this broad geographical and temporal range. So it also covers a period of decolonization, or the failure of decolonization rather, and the emergence of tax havens. So some of the contributors to this volume are today's panelists, who will have an opportunity to talk further about their chapters. And some of those are not able to be with us today. So I'm going to give you a short introduction and summary of those who are not with us today. So the volume was opened by a preface by Quinn Salodian entitled Fiscal Democracy and the Legacy of Empire. And this fantastic preface positions the volume in relation to contemporary inequality struggles, observing that regressive taxation regimes have become normalized, and argues that this, and I quote, tax justice undercuts political legitimacy. So Slobodian begins with the question of why increased knowledge of tax evasion scandals, and he gives kind of examples of these, that have facilitated the growth of private wealth at the expense of the public good has not led to bigger protest. And Slobodian observes that this volume can help to point us to the ways in which this struggle for tax justice should be at the heart of public protest and the kind of broader projects that we have around decolonisation. The introduction, written by myself and Govinda K. Bambara, continues this work of situating the volume in relation to its contemporary significance, explaining the benefits of deepening our historical knowledge of taxation regimes. The editors explain that this historical perspective opens the analytic opportunity for complicating the relationship between nation states and empires, which have so often been treated, problematically so, as distinct geopolitical units. We explain that approaches that are focused on the nation, seeing global inequality as the sum of national inequalities, and I quote, fail to recognise that global inequality has global, that is to say, colonial conditions for its emergence. So this volume situates this in relation to existing historiographical and theoretical frameworks for understanding imperial extraction and historiography of welfare states. And I'd argue that this innovative move of this volume is to connect these topics of nations and empire states, nations and empires, which are so often treated separately. So part one, institutional and fiscal issues, opens with David Brown and his chapter entitled The Great Gauge, Mortgaging Islands to Finance an Empire. Brown's chapter demonstrates how from the start of its colonial project, England leveraged both private finance as well as public taxation to finance colonialism in Ireland and generated profits to expand its colonial enterprise across the Atlantic. So Madeleine Walker we'll hear from in just a moment, the next chapter. The one following this is Samuel F. Sanchez, with a chapter entitled Madagascar and French Imperial Mercantilism, Foreign Trade and Domestic Pricing, 1895 to 1914. Sanchez explains how the French Empire was able to profit from its invasion of Madagascar in the late 19th century by cannibalizing the pre-colonial royal tax system and manipulating it to establish Madagascar as a key market for the French economy. These developments upset the economic and social relations within Madagascar, with long-term consequences for the state after colonialism. Emma Park, who also can't be with us today, wrote a chapter entitled The Right to Sovereign Seizure, Taxation, Valuation, and the Imperial British East Africa Company. So Park examines the relationship between taxation and sovereignty by looking at how the Imperial British East Africa Company used the structures of taxation for imperial extraction in Eastern Africa. She sets out the complex relationship between the assertion of corporate sovereignty and the seizure of monies in the form of tax, and the difficulties in reconciling this as corporate profits, difficulties that shape the way in which such issues continue to be debated in the present. Laura Channing, we're going to hear from in just a moment, is also with us today. So the second part of the volume is entitled Taxation and Welfare. And the chapters in this section open with my own chapter, which is entitled Taxation, Welfare and Inequalities in the Spanish Imperial States. Now, the volume really stretches from the early modern periods to the contemporary period, but in the introduction to my chapter, I tried to even trace this a little bit further back to the late Middle Ages and argue this the Iberian Peninsula. This is something that's kind of lost in this chapter. Had limited space, as you can imagine, to kind of focus on the 16th century. But the Iberian Peninsula was a series of kind of different kingdoms that extended its control over the former Muslim territories of the Islamic Iberian Peninsula in the late Middle Ages. And it did this by leveraging sovereignty effectively. So an exchange of political capital, of potential sovereign privileges, specifically taxation, in exchange for private economic capital. So we can see with these Iberian crowns, so specifically Castile and also Aragon, but there were other Spanish crowns in the there were other crowns, sorry, in the Iberian Peninsula at the time. Then we're using this kind of what we can call a public pathway partnership to state formation. And the result of this was that the Iberian Peninsula became a patchwork of privilege. And because you had what was then being described as a confederation of city-states, and different city-states had then their own powers for self-taxation. And the result of that was not a positive example of devolution, but in fact a movement towards more regressive taxation, because it meant that the peasantry in the rural areas surrounding these city-states tended to pick up the majority of the tax bill. And this was a legacy of the way in which the Spanish crowns had extended in the Iberian Peninsula. So then going into the 16th century, you have the union of the crowns and of Aragon and Castile, and this is inherited by Charles V. And when he inherits these conjoined crowns and becomes the first Habsburg ruler, which we can think of as the first Spanish crown, he's stepping into a very complicated situation that he's not fully equipped to understand, it would be fair to say. And it's a kind of complex situation, because if he wants to raise taxation, he's got to bargain with the courts, these local parliaments, and sort of justify why he's raising this taxation. And there's, due to the kind of broader moral and political and economic frameworks of the Iberian Peninsula of the late Middle Ages, there's a kind of bargaining that has to go on. Any extraction by the sovereign, for it to be just, must be kind of seen to be accompanied by a return of some kind in the form of welfare distribution or upholding justice. And in the first years, Charles V gets this terribly wrong. It results in the Comunero tax revolt, and he learns his lesson the hard way, that this is not just a kind of rhetorical gesture, but part of the kind of constitutional landscape and political and moral economy of the Iberian Peninsula. So this is one thing that's happening. The other thing that's happening in the 16th century is the Spanish crown's expansion in the Americas. And again, what we're seeing there is a kind of public-private pathway to imperial state formation, with economic capital being leveraged by the crown, and it's kind of offering then also powers for taxation, and a similar situation of kind of autonomous spheres of taxation developing also in the Americas. And again, the kind of consequence of this is hardwired pathways to inequality, also ones that become racialized, as I describe in my volume. And so we see kind of coming out of this late medieval tradition into the Americas, these different ways in which the political economy and moral economy of taxation kind of hardwire the future of certain pathways to inequality through the way in which kind of the conjoined processes of empire and states are made. So that's my volume, that's my chapter. So after this one, kind of summarising in more brevity now, Camille Saleh, who I think is joining us online, but her chapter is also on the Spanish Empire and looks at political economies of welfare of the Spanish Empire, tax and charity for the Hospital de las Naturales del Potosí, which is in modern-day Bolivia. So Saleh provides a focused example of the way the Spanish crown taxed colonial subjects to fund their welfare provision in hospitals, specifically for indigenous workers in the colonial mines of Potosí in the Viceroyalty of Peru. The mines of Potosí have been recognized as important to the history of empires and global inequalities as the site from which resources were extracted using various forms of Amerindian and African forced labor, but it's also been underexplored as a site of political governance where inhabitants were subjected to regimes of taxation and welfare. The following chapter is by Andrew McKillop, who's going to talk about his chapter in just a moment. Then we had Martin Mance, whose chapter was entitled Compromise and Adaptation in Colonial Taxation, Political Economic Governance and Inequality in Indonesia. Mance focuses on the Dutch colonial taxation system between the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. He complicates our understanding of the role of taxation simply as an extractive tool of empire, demonstrating how colonial subjects reshaped, reinterpreted, and resisted certain taxation policies in ways that had lasting legacies for the local politics and social organisation in the East Indies. Mans explains how taxation was used as a political tool to govern colonial society in Dutch Indonesia, which was made more effective by use of pre-colonial indigenous tax systems. The final chapter in this section was by Gominda K. Bamborough, entitled Imperial Revenue and National Welfare, the Case of Britain. And Gominda has already spoken to the themes that were in her chapter and indeed shaping kind of the volume as a whole. So the final section, part 3, focused on post-colonial legacies. Alexia Yates, who also can't be with us today, gave a chapter entitled Making Investor States, Haitian Foreign Debt and Neo-Colonial Economic Governance in 19th Century France. Yates explains how the French continue to benefit economically from its former colony, Haiti, even after its independence, through the way it structured its debt obligations. She further sets out the way in which involvement in international debt established modes of political engagement with France and demonstrated the character of its ongoing imperial relations. The next chapter is by Laila Latif, who's going to speak to us in just a moment. Then we had a chapter by Gregory Rawlings entitled From Capitation Tax to Tax Haven, British Fiscal Policies in a Colonial Island World. Rawlings demonstrated how between the 19th and 20th centuries, Pacific Islands transitioned from being sources of revenue through colonial taxation by European powers to sources of revenue for global elites through the creation of tax havens. The next chapter was by Alex Coburn of the Tax Justice Network, entitled Imperial Extractions and Tax Havens. And Alex is with us, and I think we'll hear a little bit about his chapter later. Is that right? I'll leave this to Alex to speak to. Then we had a chapter by Paul Gilbert, who's with us. I'm sorry, yes, so we'll hear from him later. And then finally, we had a fantastic afterwards to sum up the volume by Eloise Weber entitled Imperialism and Global Inequalities. So Weber, a specialist of international development, offers a summary of the insights on the relationships between imperial extraction and national welfare that arise in the chapters. So it's a really kind of informative summary of the different themes of the volume. Weber highlights how the chapters in the volume drew attention not only to the mechanics of the political economic regimes that created inequalities, but also to the racialized nature of these inequalities. So this is the volume, and we've now got the opportunity to hear more from some of the contributors, and I'll hand back over to our chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. So Julia's told you that this volume really travels across time and space. Another wonderful reason to pick it up. You really kind of travel around. I'm going to start. So each author is going to have 5 minutes to speak to their chapter. A little longer for Alex, who's also going to speak to some of the themes from the perspective of Tax Justice Network. We start with Madeleine Woker, who is a university assistant professor in the history of France and the Francophone world at the University of Cambridge. Thank you, Madeleine.
Thank you. So my contribution to this edited volume is titled The Cost of Thrift, the Politics of, I quote, Financial Autonomy, end quote, in the French Colonial Empire, 1900-1914. And it is part of a broader political history of taxation in the French Empire that I'm currently writing. But most importantly, it is part of this timely and rich volume and speaks to really the need to place metropolitan colonies within the same analytical frame when studying colonial taxation and extraction. This call to study France, Britain, and other nation states as imperial nation states is one that historians have made a long time ago, but as you as the two editors have made very clear, it's one that has not had as much impact, I would say, on those studying the political economy of colonialism. The key argument I make in this chapter is that when French imperialists declared colonies and Algeria, which was technically not a colony, when they declared them financially autonomous in 1900, What they really did was to entrench the transfer of the tax burden of empire onto colonized populations, who of course had little to no say in the process. And that they did so in order to preserve a very feeble fiscal bargain in European France, where mass politics had started to exert new pressures on ruling elites. Autonomy, I will grant you, is a bit of a misnomer because financial autonomy did not equate any form of financial self-determination for the millions of French colonial subjects who were living under colonial rule. Instead, it worked, I argue, as a disciplining device, which would eventually give the metropoles, the French metropole, greater control over imperial expenditures and ultimately make colonies more productive for the metropole and less costly for metropolitan taxpayers, in line with the mercantilist or neo-mercantilist and protectionist spirit of the time, which is an aspect that Samuel Sanchez develops in his own chapter in the volume. So very much like other European colonial empires, the French Empire was a globalizing and hierarchical project, which I argue created a sort of racialized imperial fiscal hierarchy, which placed the interests and livelihoods of metropolitan white citizen taxpayers above those of colonial subject taxpayers. Another aspect that I talk about in the chapter is, you've probably heard that colonial empires in the 20th century were run on the cheap or on a shoestring, and that colonial states were forced to become self-sufficient. But the implications and politics of this cheapness or thrift imperative are often left unquestioned. And what I wanted to do in this chapter was really to critically unpack these very loaded expressions and to offer some overview of the politics of imperial finance in 19th century France. And this is really to explain why these laws instauring colonial autonomy were voted and how faithful they were. So what these two laws, so there's a law voted that applied to colonies and one that applied to Algeria. What these laws did was to organize a clearer distinction between the metropolitan budget and local colonial budgets, making colonial budgets responsible for all civilian and police expenditures. The laws also introduced a provision stating that colonies could in the future be requested to reimburse military expenditures incurred on their soil. Finally, they also made colonies in Algeria into separate legal entities with the ability to issue debt. So this effectively transformed the French colonial empire into what I call a low-cost empire, which obviously existed at the expense of the majority of colonized taxpayers in the empire. Effectively, colonial financial autonomy translated into increased tax burdens for the vast majority of colonized taxpayers, that increased tax burden did not necessarily, at least in the early days of colonization, apply to European settlers who often enjoyed what I call a certain settler fiscal privilege. To cite just a few examples in colonial Algeria, the turn to autonomy in 1900 resulted in the creation of several new taxes, most importantly the tobacco tax, which fell heavily on local populations. On top of the so-called Arab taxes, this is the expression used at the time, which were only levied on Muslim Algerian non-citizens. In places like Indochina, autonomy led to the creation of the much hated fiscal monopolies on alcohol, opium, and salt. In France's West African colonies, the early 1900s also overlapped with the mass introduction and increase of so-called capitation tax, so head taxes. And these heavy tax burdens generated synchronous and often very violent tax revolts throughout the empire in the aftermath of the decision to make colonies financially autonomous. Right, so this is pretty much what the chapter does, have I used up my 5 minutes? So yes,
I encourage everybody to self-chair as and I'm to Laura Channing, who's Assistant Professor of Economic History in the Department of History at Durham University. Laura,
Thanks very much.
So I mean, Madeline set me up perfectly for talking about my chapter, and it takes this idea of empire and inequality that runs through the whole book and examines really how this played out in practice, and thinking about inequalities at the within colony level in one very specific case, which is Sierra Leone in the late 19th, early 20th century. So one of the main themes of the book that it really engages with is this idea of asymmetry in tax and expenditure, and the fact that different taxpayers had different relationships to colonial states, to imperial states, to taxing institutions, and really using this like inequality and difference idea to think about how taxpayers were accessed by the state and their relationship with the state, which ones were kind of held close and which ones were more at arm's length. So it starts from the premise that all empires governed differently, and that this was very deliberate. This is a conscious strategy to structure inequalities and to maintain and exacerbate them. The chapter argues that taxes are a particularly good way at getting at these differences. You have to categorize people to tax them. And it's a good way of thinking about how colonial populations were incorporated into empire. Taxes are like the predominant way that a state is engaging with its population. So who were these colonial taxpayers? What did it mean? Like in practice, what do you have to do as a colonial taxpayer? How was each group taxed? How did their categorization into these groups and the built-in inequalities of empire structure the tax system, and importantly also the patterns of expenditure? So in most colonies, this is not unusual, there was no single tax for which all subjects were liable. But this is happening at the same point as European countries, or these nation states, are including the USA as well, moving towards income taxes by the early 20th century. They're kind of assigning the same fiscal weight to each individual within a single fiscal code. Colonial systems within the same imperial state are doing the opposite. They're dividing up their taxpaying population. So scholarship on colonial taxation has like really taken off in the last 2 decades, especially within like economic history. And there's been a real focus on fiscal policy, balancing budgets, exactly as Mother has said, this kind of the revenue imperative, empire on the cheap. And we know how important this is now, but a lot of the work was compared between colonies, and now the attention is really turning to the differences within them. So this is exactly what my chapter in this volume looks at, and again, it's also part of a bigger project thinking about colonial fiscal systems and imperial states, taxpayers within them. So this looks at a single fiscal system, Sierra Leone, and it's concerned with the interaction between the tax system and inequality. So how existing inequalities inform the design of the tax system, and then in turn, how the spending of that tax revenue could either exacerbate or ameliorate inequalities. So obviously this is something that applies everywhere, always, but I think within an empire, these channels of inequality intersect with this pressure to rely solely on local sources of funding, and also intersect with this tendency for empires to govern different people differently. And what I argue is that essentially these two pressures lead to a patchwork of colonial tax categories that both reflect and then further entrench existing inequalities. So the main approach here is this within colony comparison of different taxpayer categories, designed to really capture the internal heterogeneity of colonial tax systems. Sierra Leone is a really interesting case for this. I always would argue that it's not an exception at this point, but it might be more extreme than certain other cases, making it a really good one to show what's happening here. It was by the late 19th century, it was Britain's oldest West African colony. So it was founded in the late 18th century as a settlement of freed slaves. From then it was ruled as a standalone crown colony for much of the 19th century. The 1890s bring a struggle for Africa, and in 1896, the annexation of neighboring territory as a protectorate. In 1893, a municipal council with a black settler majority was created in Freetown, which included some representation. So by 1900, Sierra Leone is a composite polity of a coastal crown colony, a rural protectorate, and an urban settler municipality. So each of these have their own administrative system, their own tax regime, their own patterns of expenditure. And I think a really nice phrase that captures this is Catherine Boone's phrase, which is an uneven topography of the African state. So to briefly sum up, very briefly sum up. So I think there are two important things to take away from this in disaggregating these categories of taxpayer. First, there's not one taxing institution, even within what we call a colonial state and then the wider imperial state as well. So when we think about colonial taxes, we so often think about the colonial government, but actually, and it's very important, obviously it's one of the most important functions of administrations, but other institutions are also doing taxing in these colonies. Chiefs are taxing their subjects in labour and in cash. City councils are collecting urban taxes and spending them only within the urban area. Sometimes, you know, these are elected councils too. So I think it's really important to think about in terms of what it means to be a colonial taxpayer and what it means to have these internal inequalities, to think about the fact that these are very different types of individual impositions. And it's crucial also to understand how they coexisted, how multiple taxing institutions developed in conversation with one another, and how one individual might be paying multiple taxes to multiple institutions in a single year. And the other thing is to also think about spending. The provision for some taxes to be spent in areas where it was collected mean that, you know, this is explicitly retained these particular taxpayers, but then more general or regional risk redistribution could occur at the whole colony level, meaning that spending could be kind of skewed by devolved institutions and the kind of perceived potential of certain areas. And so the spending can kind of completely change the nature of the tax collection in terms of what it means for what people get in return for the revenue.
Thank you so much. I now turn to senior lecturer in Scottish history at the University of Glasgow, which might be one of these other institutions there's story to tell about philanthropy and empire. Andrew, take the floor.
Put it mildly, yeah. First of all, can I just thank Julia for inviting me to join in what is an excellent collection of publishing. Poverty, Health and Imperial Wealth in Early Modern Scotland was the title of my chapter, and I suppose what it tries to do is to use the Scottish example to explore themes of welfare provision and how that relates to changes in society, particularly a massively colonising society that's now exposed to new forms of economic productivity and emigration, particularly. And in that debate, who then becomes entitled to that welfare provision. And the argument of the chapter is that in the Scotland example, and I think with obvious implications for the rest of the UK and Ireland, and understand that in the early modern period, without understanding the centrality of empire to that set of debates. That empire creates a series of discourses where we can see Scottish and British society embed and normalise inequality welfare provision designed to embed inequality, not to ameliorate it, but to embed it. Scotland, the chapter argues, offers a really distinctive and probably even stark example of the fundamental opposition, heart and volume that empires make nations, that nations make empire make nations. And the Scottish example is perhaps useful to show the power of that by pointing out it's one of the nations, arguably the nation in designs that was unmade by empire. And its failure to be a colonial power at the end of the 17th century forces a financial and national crisis that predicates union. So for any of the anti-woke people who say exaggerate the power of empire to nation, you might want to use the example of the Scottish nation was unmade by empire, made the British nation. So the chapter argues, first of all, that that dynamic created in Scottish society a particularly intense set of civic debates over the role of emigration, empire, and improvement, and saw these as entangled. Empire seemed to offer a trajectory to wealth, but also seemed to offer a route to systemic inequalities. And that debate is extremely intense across the first 100 years of the Scottish Union. Scotland benefits from empire in spectacular ways. Its improvement of the economic lift off of the 18th and 19th century It means in a way empire makes Scotland a wealthy nation, more so than any other part of these islands. England were already quite wealthy, it's just made more wealthy. Scotland is poverty stricken, it's made extremely wealthy in key areas. But it also induces massive insecurities and tensions around that process. Empire that brings wealth brings massive emigration to the country with the smallest population base, it's moving population. So does empire improve while Scotland underdevelops. There is the movement of new types of immigrants back in, particularly the immigrants that have benefited either from enslaved labour or from the mass clearing off of Indian taxation by the East India Company. Scotland probably gains more from slavery and East India wealth than any other region outside of London. The result is a flow of new economic migrants in and a flooding of dark money to its financial and political sectors, which cause major instability. In other words, empire is a profoundly double-edged sword. It both improves and underdevelops society. And in that kernel, or the crucible of that debate, welfare becomes a key route to square the circle of that piece of the argument chapter. Colonial wealth poured into Scotland's welfare and philanthropy sector in conspicuous ways. Hospitals, asylums, poor relief systems, new technical schools are appearing all over Scottish society, designed to produce a new socially disciplined and productive labour force. That, at its heart, is producing new forms of social inequality. In that way, empire ceases to be the problem, it becomes the solution. So the argument that the chapter tries to argue is that we need to, in a sense, create a bundle of connections. The extractive power of the colonial state, but also emigration, puts emigration at the heart of that, alongside the way welfare access, or access to welfare becomes a way of socially disciplined forms of population for a capitalist economy, and deciding who is and is not in the nation, and what applies to social inequality. That's the challenge.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I now go to Laila Latif, who lectures at the University of Nairobi School of Law, and is also working on a doctorate at Cardiff Law and Politics. Laila.
Thank you, thank you. I'm just happy to also report that I managed to finish that document.
Dr. Laila Latif.
Yeah, that's better anymore, so thankful for that. I mean, I've just been listening to all that we've been saying, and what I feel is that the common theme of practical is fantastic book that we all come together to contribute, but we get so many different forms of taxation, right? And I've put down some points like taxes, politics, quickly, so I want to say that taxes, economics, taxes, power, tax is ugly, tax is a creature of colonial capitalism, tax creates economic arrangements that have resulted in inequalities. Tax promotes differential privileges, and all these things happen to cut across the chapter that I wrote. Because what I was saying is that tax should have a redistributive power. And it does that by moving a state towards a modern welfare system, which has not really happened for Kenya, because the entire tax design for Kenya has been rooted in its colonial history, which has not really reflected a commensurate relationship between the people, the money they earn, the money they pay to the state, and then the sort of well-being needs the state finances for them. So what we're seeing is that during the colonial period, the tax system for Kenya was designed with a purpose. And the purpose was simple, that we're here to extract as much as we can, because the empire's fiscal needs or its fiscal obligations had simply been rounded and brought into Kenya as imperatives. That, you know what, we need to extract, and for us to extract, you need to finance your own development needs. But we're not going to finance these for you. So that was the system that was put in place, that you have a native indigenous population that's working to pay the hut tax, the poll tax, the land tax, is working in the farm that are being owned by the white settlers, but they're not getting access to healthcare, they're not getting access to education. Of course, the missionaries were there that are providing this, but this was not the obligation of the state. And then what happened is that you talked about the double-edged sword, right? So here you have colonial rule that's coming to extract, but at the same time, denying sort of an image about themselves that, look,
we know you have development needs that need to be financed, but we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to create what we call local native councils that are, chaired by traditional African chiefs. And these African chiefs would get people together and tell them that if you want to finance your needs, you have to be able to come up with the money yourself. So we had the system of Majimboism, which was an offshoot of colonialism. You have the colonial master, they're not going to finance your needs. You have to finance your needs yourself, but you still have to pay tax to your colonial master, right? And that was a conceptualization of the Kenyan tax system. But then at independence, the assumption was that you will then have your fiscal jurisdiction to be able to sort out or redesign your entire tax system, which would help you move towards a modern welfare state. So then at independence, the Kenyan government again came up with this concept of African socialism. And they said African socialism is where we're going to design or redesign or recharacterize our tax system so that it then responds to redistribution. But at the point that they were discussing this at Lancaster House, the Independence Constitution, they were buffered against any changes to the tax system that was already in place. Because if you want to access the international market, you have to have this tax system that responds to the market needs, and the market needs are capitalist needs, they're neoliberal capitalist needs. So the Kenyan government was frustrated for making this change. This meant that you have that power to make law, but not really change the law to fit into your ideal of African socialism. In other words, there happened to be like a manifestation. Colonial tax system simply just transposed itself into a post-colonial system. So you think it's an African system, but it's not, because it's still responding to the needs of the metropolitan market. And this has further implications in the international system, whereby we're noticing a lot of power asymmetries. You have Kenya, for example, not really be able to have a say in redefining the tax norms at the international stage, because the international institutions, IMF, OECD, World Bank, and discusses in the chapter, they've just been reconstituted as the previous empire, right? It's Britain, it's England, about that. But the OECD, the IMF, it's all about the previous colonial empires, and they already organized what the tax norms are going to be. So this meant that African nations, the post-colonial states, when they joined the international framework, they could not really redefine this tax norm. They couldn't be participatory players. They could only interact. And that's the problem we're seeing. And that actually prevents the country domestically then to also move towards a welfare state because their tax norms are locked to what is the demand of foreign capital. So basically, the theme that I was tackling in my paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Lila. Great. And wonderfully on time as well. So we now go to Paul Gilbert, who is a senior lecturer in international development at the University of Sussex.
Thank you, and thank you, Linda, Julia, and everyone for writing this book on this event. My chapter speaks to those three big themes that Linda spoke about at the start: national redistribution, colonial history, and global redistribution, in relation to two development institutions, the Crown Agents and the CDC Group, which was the Colonial Development Corporation, and then the Commonwealth Development Corporation, and then just the CDC Group. And since the book went to press, has changed its name again. It's now British International Investments, or part of that. So what I try and do in this chapter is trace the history of these institutions, how they have evolved and mutated from the age of formal British Empire through independence and formal decolonization to present. And to give an example of the kind of changes they've experienced, the Crown Agents started out as the agent managing currency reserves and procuring contracts for British colonies when waves of independence and decolonization swept through the empire, and the Crown Agents had no more colonies to manage procurement for. Someone there got a bit bored, got involved in some fringe banking, some insurance scams, and had to be bailed out several times by the government before sort of mutating now into a quasi-private consultancy that does a lot of work consulting on tax reform. So both organizations have always been implicated in some way in management of fiscal resources across empire. The Crown Agents managed sterling reserves for colonies, often transferring reserves back to the metropole, back to London, with the corresponding kind of austerity regime enabling the collection of those reserves. And sometimes the Crown Agents invested those sterling reserves in UK local and national government bonds, so essentially lending colonial reserves to the British government to help with sort of political reconstruction workers that was talking about. To the point that some independence leaders discovered with great surprise upon independence that the reserves were tied up in very to the UK for a long time. That's deals that no independent nation would ever agree to. And then, as I said, more recently, and the new guys, they commissioned using official aid spending to manage the transformation of taxation revenue collection systems across many foreign companies. CDC Group, or whatever it's called today, on the other hand, has long invested in commercial activities with sort of agricultural infrastructure. It's always struggled to neatly explain what the development impacts of those activities are. So what makes them different, especially today, to any other fund manager. But they have, since their founding, defended their choice of investment with reference to the interests of the British taxpayer, not necessarily the governmental priorities of the countries where they invest. Sometimes those investments in the period again that I've been talking about, post-war welfare state reconstruction period, the CDC Group, or Commonwealth Development Corporation, had a role in investing in export industries that could earn dollars that could then be transferred to the UK so they could pay back their debts and not run down their sterling reserves. And they also invested in infrastructure, sometimes seemingly in quite an extractive way. One of the first things the finance minister did after the Grenadian Socialist Revolution was challenge the CDC Group about the amount of asset stripping they seem to be doing, the infrastructure that they had invested in there. So the chapter contributes to the themes of the volume by examining how the collection of tax in imperial possessions and the allocation of those fiscal resources shaping welfare state construction in the UK and metropole, and the justification of spending decisions in relation to empire and nation is kind of where we need to understand the prehistory of what today we call the development aid sector. Where I would hope the chapter might open up thinking about current issues is it's useful to bear in mind that over the last 10 years there's been a progressive increase on managing the UK's aid budget in the interests of the British taxpayer, right? Not in the interests of any kind of global redistribution or reparation, but there's been an explicit, sometimes DFID or CEO literally writes press releases in response to taxpayer alliance or Daily Mail articles about British taxpayer resources being wasted on the other side of the world, right? And as I mentioned, the Crown Agents now exist as a contractor that receives aid-funded business, and recent OECD report shows that about 70% of the contracts awarded using the aid budget from UK go to UK-based consultancies, right? So again, the aid system participates in a form of national redistribution coloured by colonial histories and not straightforwardly in the kind of global redistribution you might all imagine. I'm probably about to run out of time, but the final thing I want to say about how we could think about these questions of colonial history, national redistribution, global redistribution through these organisations and through the aid budget is as part of my current project, I've been interviewing a lot of UK aid contractors, and a lot of them are very worried about their business because the UK government is reallocating sort of potentially up to half the aid budget to in-country refugee support for Ukrainian refugees. Right? Now, a lot of that money is going to contractors, but another pretty substantial amount is going to local authorities to support refugee housing and accommodation. The local authorities who are facing sort of years and years of austerity are complaining that they're not being given enough by the government through the aid budget to cover those costs, right? So there is really some kind of intimate connection between how austerity and inequality is experienced at the level of municipal finance and the forms of global redistribution through the aid system that we might want to be reparative, but aren't. And there's also through even these organizations winning aid contracts, the history of colonial taxation, so fiscal colonialism in the there. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you. And last but very certainly not least, we have Alex Cogan, who's Chief Justice of the Tax Justice, Chief Executive, not Chief Justice. Chief Executive of the Tax Justice Network and the Commissioner for the Scottish Government's Poverty and Inequality Commission. Alex is going to speak to the chapter as well as the wider kind of reflections. Thank you, Alex.
Thanks. If there is a tax executive, we definitely have a chief justice. But I reread the volume on the way here, and you know, remembering just the energy of the sessions that we have online. And so while it's very nice to discover that everyone wants legs, it really became nice to feel that energy again, all of the papers we've heard just a little bit about today. For Tax Justice Network, we're honoured to be able to support it a bit, and I'm grateful to the community, particularly for letting us participate and accepting that from me. As Quinn Trevilian said in the preface, these aren't historical issues, they are crucial to our understanding today and to the pursuit of tax justice in particular. So I will talk a bit about that, but let me perhaps go through a few points from my chapter first. Before that, one thing, if I pull out a scene, and you've heard it from the set of speakers already, it's one that Gurwinder framed in her chapter. The new fiscal sociology put forward this idea that the relations of extracting taxation and distribution of welfare create a web of generalized reciprocity. And if we understand that the population is subject to the relations of extraction and the relations of distribution are not the same, the question is, what does that mean for our understanding of tax and for the related fiscal sociology and very many other things? I think that's a question that runs through pretty much every chapter, where these populations are not the same, what is the implication? So we were talking in tax justice terms about the four arms of tax as being kind of the key set of things that tax bring to the effective state. Revenue and redistribution, this is easily. Repricing, which is the pricing of things like tobacco consumption or carbon emissions that have a lot of social profit and benefits. And then the fourth arm that often overlooked, representation, is when people pay tax that they feel a link to the government and ability to hold the government accountable. We know that's an evidence at the individual level, but also at the national level. One of the only things that's consistently associated with governments that are less corrupt and more representative is the share of government expenditure that comes through taxation rather than other sources. So this relationship is kind of fundamental. What happens if the web of generalized reciprocity underpinning that doesn't underpin that because the population is subject to relations are not the same? In my chapter, I talk about the three imperial ages of illicit financial flows to sort of think through how we get to the global inequalities we have now and the role of tax. That first age of illicit flows is the age of falling empire, in which, as we've heard today, and as we see in each of the chapters, there are different actors involved, very often using tax as part of the effectively violent extraction under empire, and illegitimate extraction of wealth from majorities. The second age is one that Vanessa Ogle has worked on, which is the age of funk money, where in this moment where independence was coming, or perhaps there, and at the same time in the metropolis, you had increasing levels of income taxes to fund war. People were concerned about their assets and income stream within tolerances and sought alternative ways to protect them, both from the possibility of expropriation by newly independent states and the possibility of taxation in the metropolis, but not wishing to lose the legal protections that come with being part of empire. And it's in that period that Vanessa writes about where you see the development of the first heathen state, using typically, but not only, the British system of law to offer the protection of assets and income streams and they're hiding the opacity from the state at either end, both the colonial or former colony and the imperial power, the former imperial power at the other end. And that's what gives rise to the third age of illicit financial flows in which we are all now living, a globalization in which the offshoring of assets and income streams, whether corporate or individual, isn't some marginal activity, it's at the heart of our period of globalization. Now, each of those three ages are or can be seen as ways in which that web of generalized reciprocity is broken, in which the extractions of the relations of extraction and distribution are applying to different populations in quite different ways, but each of them consistently undermining the full level of tax in the countries in question. And not just robbing revenues, what we estimate is something like $500 billion a year being lost across border tax abuse. And of course, that is the tip of the iceberg, because all of those losses are used in terms to justify it, as Ray talked about, to justify closing the policy space of the country, because you are afraid of the risk of capital flight, so to speak, the risk of profit shifting, the risk of asset and income streams being offshore in a way you cannot protect yourself from. You are constrained from raising your rates of tax towards the progressive tax system that you might otherwise achieve, whether you're a former colony or former imperial power. The dynamic traces back to the positions that the International Imperial Commerce were taking in the negotiations was considering tax in the 1930s, as according to the volumes of globalists talked through very. So, for the tax strategy, one more thing, in effect, what that means is through the four levels, you're not just taking money that states could use to be more inclusive and to provide better conditions for people, you're taking away the thing upon which representation is dependent. So it's statehood ultimately that is being extracted, most importantly in each of those three ages of the flows. So for the tax justice, we're coming back to the policy side. What does that mean? We've got two key things there. If you were to kind of caricature the vision of tax justice 20 years ago, it's our 20th anniversary, by the way. And it's a bit simpler than the one that we think about now. It's about understanding the international obstacles that exist to prevent the pursuit of tax justice and the policy agenda at the national level. So we need to deal with tax havens because they stop us doing what we need to do in terms of tax policy here. Now, this is worthy and legitimate, but it doesn't take into account the sort of issues that this volume raises to the extent that we increasingly do now. Because we can understand now that it's not just external obstacles to what we're doing at home, it's the need to repair the set of power relations internationally, to think about how international tax and transparency rule setting takes place. The extent to which that continues to be at the OECD or related institutions that are effectively part of imperial powers and separation. And then to consider the global inequalities that we face now as both the result of that ongoing set of power relations, but also the cumulative result of those three ages of illicit financial flows, all of which are effectively flowing in direction away from countries that we might now call poor, ones we might now call rich. And that brings me to the following exciting point. With an enormous breakthrough we probably missed in the last quarter of 2022, for the first time, after decades of efforts, and in particular, 5 or 6 years of very concerted effort by the global tax justice movement, the United Nations passed a resolution to create a process of intergovernmental discussion on a new international tax cooperation framework at the UN, to move rule setting away from the rich countries club at the OECD and into a genuinely inclusive setting at the UN. There is a long way to go on that road, and after the vote, pretty much all of the core OECD members expressed their deep dissatisfaction that it happened, and the need to protect and not duplicate the fantastic work of the OECD. But the resolution passed by unanimous consent. Every country in the world, despite their backed it. And we're now into a protest where the Secretary General is preparing a report on the possibilities of this. And the engine is a resolution, is a convention, I could say, of some form, a multilateral UN instrument, which creates an intergovernmental tax rule setting body on the UN authority. That is the break in global power relations that this body will answer. What it does not deliver, even if the next few years are successful in that, is the reparative work necessary in terms of those creative financial flows that strict practices resources in one direction. But it creates the possibility to stop the clock on the tax abuses that continue today. And that is the biggest step forward. Then I think 20 years ago, my predecessor at the Tax Justice Network imagined possible. So we are far from achieving it, but what is laid out in this really important volume is the basis for understanding that underpins the prioritisation of that work, rather than, for example, technical fixes at the OECD that inevitably play out in ways that continue to be unfair, however technically good they may be. I'll finish with that note of optimism and encourage everyone to ask your government what position they're taking in the UN discussion.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you to you and to all the panelists for amazing insights into the chapters in the volume. We're now going to open up for questions, comments. Fergal, I'll ask you if there are any questions online.
I just suggest maybe we keep it in the room. The chat is open, the Q&A open, but we have just.
All right, that's fine. Please feel free to raise your hand, introduce yourself, and ask a question to one of the panelists.
Just got to be back in person and then we can see you.
Well, I might ask a question just while, and I'm going to ask it to Alex because I'm so excited what you were saying at the end about UN resolution. So, do you have a way of explaining how it came about, given how good the global north has historically been at blocking forms of change? Is it because they think it won't really change, or has something shifted in, let's say, the bureaucratic landscape even involved in discussions?
That's a really good question. I think there's two things. The defence of the OECD has always been, this is where the expertise is, and this is where tax change is going to be effective. And then, as they come under great pressure from the likes of us, particularly in the last 10 years, they've created a single inclusive framework, which requires new members both to pay an annual fee to the OECD for the pleasure and to sign up to all the previous for tax rule changes, and still they don't get an effective vote, so there's no vote. But that's the defence that the OECD actually is inclusive. Both of those have really kind of fallen apart in the last few years. On the effectiveness side, most OECD members are pretty disappointed with where the OECD got to after basically 10 years of base erosion profit shifting processes. There will be Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 deal, but Pillar 1 has collapsed from being all multinationals and all their profits down to a tiny bit of profits of a small number of multinationals only. So there's very little benefit, even to the OECD members who benefit disproportionately. Pillar 2, which is the global minimum tax, has collapsed from something quite ambitious to something that will barely put the floor under where things are and lose a lot of options for abuse. The OECD members themselves were pretty unhappy about this in general, and many of them will not be part of the law. The argument for saying no, the OECD is great, this is where it's at, is pretty hard to make. And on the inclusiveness side, what the inclusive framework has done is create some expectation that began in 2019 that there will be a voice for the Asian countries. The main effect of that to date has been to piss off everybody involved because there hasn't been any kind of effective voice or inclusion at all. and the OECD secretariat in a whole set of different ones that has crossed lines and offended with people who might not have bothered if they're not been involved, but because they thought there was something to engage in, have found that it's sort of interesting than we thought. So it's a combination of OECD being less willing to defend something that's really not working for them, and non-members being more angry about the way they cast out, even when they're on paper being included. I think that's the energy that we have to hope.
Any questions in the room? Yes.
I'm Martin Nielsen, I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, and I work in the International Centre for Tax and Development, doing research tax policy administration in many African countries. And I think this volume has been really, it's kind of a bit embarrassing that we got involved in this literary question. And it's been a really good challenge to me and my colleagues. So I guess the question I'm wondering about, on the international side, which I'm more familiar with, it's very clear, as Alex has laid out, for kind of the way in which an infrastructure built in a colonial period is kind of handled as a day international tax models. If you look at the domestic earlier bits, is there anything we can see in present day tax and welfare systems of the former countries that is still a hand from the stories that maybe it's in the chapter different councils. And one thing I know, for example, is that if you look at the tax and both the tax structure and the efficiency of francophone and Anglophone countries, they differ in a way that's clearly happened. Is there anything you can tell us about kind of inequality, damage, and water that we still see today?
Yeah, I think I was actually having a reflection on that, and I thought about it and I said, well, we have the domestic state now, and it has a tax system that was given to it, basically handed over to it as independence. Has it really changed, or does it still reflect the same principles that the imperial period brought about it? And I look at it in terms of the differential treatment that we continue to provide foreign capital with, and then juxtapose that to what sort of incentives are we giving to SMEs, to domestic corporations in Kenya, for example? Are they the same in the sense that if we have a multinational corporation bringing in foreign capital, are they given tax benefits? Should they be given tax benefits? But what about our own local companies? Are they given the same tax benefits as foreign international companies given? And the answer is no, right? Because heavily we feel that development is all about what comes from outside, not that you can build it from within your domestic architecture. So you feel that if you have FDI coming into your country, yeah, we want to attract FDI, therefore we must give them privileges. But at the same time, we forget that we also have companies that can be better for economic development and growth if they're provided with these tax privileges as well. So we still continue to battle with that. It is an issue, but at the same time, I think because of the idea of tax justice, there's been a lot of noise out there that we have to be fair, we have to be equitable. So there's some sort of fiscal policy changes that are now taking place in Kenya, even in other neighboring East African countries, to recognize the need for tax incentives, and that tax incentives should be given to SMEs and not really to foreign multinational corporations, because we've got extensive literature that says FDI will come into the country whether or not you get tax benefits or not. So I think that inequality that existed during Kenya's colonial period, where tax incentives were only given to the white settlers bringing in their capital and not given to the indigenous nations who are trying to build the economy by coming up with these small enterprises. It still resonates across the Income Tax Act, but with an awareness that, you cannot have these discussions without the involvement of the public. So this idea of public participation in tax decision making is really taken heavy root in Kenya, which is now sort of maybe redesigning the tax system that we've had, making it more pro-domestic rather than international. So that's my response, Martin.
Can I just ask you, Leila, because one of the things from reading your chapter and reading some other stuff around that, so tell me if this is wrong, but the white settlers who came, they didn't come bringing capital, they came and took the land, and by taking the land, they developed farming on it and so on, and they weren't taxed on any of the income that was made on
Yes.
the farm, and that after independence, that was something the British government required the Kenyan government to continue, was to exempt white settlers who now were white Kenyans
Yeah.
from any income tax,
Absolutely.
whereas their workers had to pay income tax. So
Yes.
one
Yes.
explicit legacy is not only do these white settlers take the land, so they're not bringing in capital,
Absolutely.
and they're exempt, and they're still
Exactly.
exempt,
Exactly.
which
Yes.
is.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
They only tax
so-
the point at which they import, so there's import taxation, but other than on their income, it's still within the ordinances that have signed during independence to be example. So that's still.
Yeah, I was gonna say one thing on well, it's not really the present day, but I guess the long lasting legacies of the autonomy principle. This is one thing I wanted to say, and I guess it ties back to what Alex was saying about Vanessa Ogle's work, which is really trailblazing and very interesting, and the ways she's traced how the settler money then gets funneled into tax havens. And I had the chance to look at the archives of the French consul in Monaco in the 60s. There's a conflict between de Gaulle at the time and Monaco authorities over the money, especially of so-called overseas French people. So those exiles from empire who arrived went back to the metropole after 1962, and lots of them actually went to Monaco or other tax havens instead of going back to the metropole, and they used the autonomy principle to justify being taxed at a lower level. So they basically, what they said to the French authorities is, no, our taxes and the tax systems under which we were governed were actually governed by the autonomy principle, which makes us different kinds of taxpayers. We're overseas French taxpayers. We're not metropolitan taxpayers. And that was long after the autonomy principle had been officially jettisoned by the French state. So these are it's just one of the ways in which that autonomy principle then moved on and contributed to current day inequalities and the making of tax havens.
We've got it here with London. Well, that's the colonial policy that continues through to the present.
Yeah, so incredibly interesting, and particularly the connections across things that are coming out. So I was buzzing, so this may not make sense, but in relation to challenge to the new fiscal sociology, the new fiscal sociology relates to an old sociology of welfare state, the sociology around social rights of citizenship. We can see that the social rights of citizenship were restricted to the metropole. But the arguments around social rights of citizenship also had this sort of subtext about industrial citizenship, which was to do with the creation of a common status in employment. So much of the sociology in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that was talking about the generalization of a common status and the undermining of differences, status differences that might have occurred between salaried and waged employment and so on. So the really interesting thing in relation to arguments about how some of this traces back to the League of Nations is the League of Nations. I wasn't aware that it had a tax process, but it had a process about, of course, parceling up all on some sort of central powers and their former colonies and reparceling among the protectorates. But it also created labour standards. Those labour standards were different for the European powers from those of colonies and protectorates. So I'm wondering whether there is any formal connection between the discussions of the labour standards and discussions of taxation, given that both were being debated at the League of Nations at the same time. I'm intrigued because I've accidentally got into the League of Nations, and I don't quite know how, but and the labour standards was interesting to discover that there were tax policies in there. I think there's some, and though labour standards and welfare and tax are going together within social rights of citizenship, the social scientists have allowed them to be separated. Actually, they were always together and always different. So maybe in the three phases that you described, partly, yes, it is not simply an unraveling of certain kinds of tax regimes, but also the unraveling of labour regimes as well, domestically.
Thank you, John. I'm gonna just hold that for a minute. We've got a question from online as well, so maybe take, and if anybody else in the group wants to.
Yeah. We've got a question from Anne Eggleton to the whole panel. Do panelists consider that the UK population would be more supportive of the need for the Lost and Damaged Fund to help alleviate climate justice? The historical mismatch between extraction and redistribution is more widely known and understood as part of the reason for poor welfare systems in ex-colonies.
Right. Okay, who wants to come in on either John's question or the point about, I guess, public understanding of the relationship between extraction and redistribution?
One thing that I briefly said about the labour and the taxation is that in the colonial context, the labour is a taxation. And actually, like the forced labour conventions that like the ILO and the League of Nations have kind of thinking about how to make colonies like adhere to some sort of labour standard, but actually like these things continue to function as a tax for a long time. It's kind of like pushed down to a more and more communal level to essentially make they're still functioning as a kind of stream of revenue. One of the challenges with like this kind of thing is trying to like bring that into conversation with taxes paid in cash, and think about like the relative contributions of like the labour and cash taxes together, and how somebody might have to do both in 1 year. Yeah.
Alex.
I'm intrigued. I didn't know the League of Nations worked on labour, because you have your own. But it makes a lot of sense. There's the League of Nations in the late 20s and early 30s basically took the decision that on which I got the tax rate of £30, which was that instead of taxing multinationals at the global level, units of the multinational as a whole, and then working out according to where the activity is, where profit should be taxed. So your employment, half your employment, half your sales are in the UK, and then half your profit gets declared there at the end. And the UK employees whatever rate it has. Instead, they introduce the unemployment for the different subsidiaries of international trade with each other, in theory, at the market price, the unemployment price. And if they do, then profits will end up in the right place. Even though none of those subsidiaries are profit maximum, not in itself, but the theory would say it's profit maximum. It already, and the reason multinational exists is it because it's more efficient than if you were at arm's length. But that's what they went for. What Prince Williams, the globalists, the UK working through this, but we talked about particularly the economists who work with the ICC, pushing the position into the League of Nations that they want to do on lots of other things, but I think we need to do. And their main concern is that you protected with the end of empire, you protected the freedom of capital, you protected capitalism expropriation, and you certainly get it from any kind of unreasonable taxation, and you made sure that labour rights were moved around to become an obstacle to the effective allocation of capital and the returns on it. So I suspect that very extremely by looking at what the ICC were doing on the labour side of the League of Nations. And I think that would be cascaded all the way through. This the last year planting on your question. I think this is at some point the ICC accepted that they wouldn't get a legal deal with everything they wanted it to. And that the way they get more of what they want to do is to push bilateral deals. They were particularly investment deal, but tax treaties would fall in the field that we do. Because individually you could pick off a foreign colony more effectively and push the rates down and the competitive research to say, well, you can't take more than the next person. And whereas in global discussion, you might end up in a different place because of the upstarts now dimensions. Hence, on tax, it's the OECD that created to take on tax rather than allowing it to move from originations to another nation. Who knows what might happen on these twin fighting.
I suppose, I mean, I would make 2 points. I think one, the idea, legacies of the colonial era in terms of labour and relationship to tax, obviously there is no start in former colonised societies, but the same dynamic is occurring, particularly in the modern period. So, for example, the need to discipline the labour force away from its own model economy to a capitalist economy occurs at exactly the same time on the what's called the early ones sin taxes, i.e., you are taxing their consumption. What are the key consumption goods? Tobacco, sugar, and tea. In other words, colonial free movement of colonial commodities then becomes a way in which you discipline and acculturate a labour force through new forms of productivity, but you then retrograde to tax that workforce at a regressive rate, and that has massive implications for this group and what you get welfare for. In that sense, much of the assumptions and languages behind effectiveness, benefit, etc., is a direct legacy of colonial impact inside these items, just to shoot the eyes.
Thank you. I've got Paul, then I've got another question.
So I'm going to try and start a response to my question. It's a great question. I think I remember it right. Would the population be more supportive of loss and damage financing the historical mismatch between extraction and redistribution is more well understood? I think that'd be a good start. But like any sort of education-based idea of social change, you know, there's more to it than just being aware of that history. And one thing that I think would complicate the idea that it's just about making aware of it is the way people form ideas of themselves as members of communities of taxpayers, or Rebecca Bramwell talks about taxpayer subjectivities and the way in which they're often a lot more twisty and difficult than we expect, right? She looks at how the public sort of shaming of celebrity tax cheats in sort of early years of the austerity period that we're now the second decade of, you know, that seems like it might be a tax justice concern, but it very quickly that discourse got appropriated by his alliance again, and became about, you know, sort of the deserving and the undeserving citizen, right? So I'm against the tax cheat not because they're depriving redistributive capacities of the common good, but I'm against the tax cheat because I pay tax and I want to get what I deserve, and then it morphs into a sort of anti-undeserving or anti-welfare sentiment, right? So there's always ways of forming sort of activities around being a taxpayer and who gets extracted from, who gets redistributed from, that simply making people aware of that history wouldn't be enough. And the second pole to why that would be good but not enough is that the loss and damage financing, the urgency and necessity of it is about more than fiscal extraction, but other forms of extraction and uneven accumulation. So, you know, people like Kirsten Perry writes about reparations and climate vulnerability in the Caribbean, right? Where there's a sort of geographical vulnerability, but also vulnerability created by the extraction that accompanied the slave trade and plantation economy that was more than fiscal extraction, but was sort of capital extraction that then was transferred back to the UK, and all of the other sort of accompanying forms of extraction violence that would require some kind of reparation that will be for the damage. So yes, it would be nice if people are more aware of it. I don't think it would be quite enough to shift people to support loss and damage without sort of work on those tax-personal activities that involve a broader understanding of Britain's history as a extractive empire that go beyond histories.
Right, thank you, Paul. I've got Govinda.
Yeah, I mean, just to add briefly to what Paul was saying there, I mean, I think sort of productive disagreements and so on, I think it is important that those histories would make a difference, because in part, we don't know them at all. The extent to which the entirety of Britain's social infrastructure, public welfare, goods, institutions, roads, buildings, etc. There is nothing in this country that isn't financed by colonial extraction. Absolutely nothing, not even the welfare state, because the British population historically has not paid taxes, or the welfare policies of Britain have not been funded through the taxes of national citizens. They've been funded through the taxes of colonial citizens and the resources and other things that have been sort of taken from there. And in the context of sort of climate change, I mean, Pete and I wrote a piece recently looking at the fact that climate change itself is colonially constituted. So if you look at the floods in Pakistan that have just happened, they're entirely a consequence of the colonial infrastructure that was established in the area, damming up rivers in order to enable industrial growth for the benefit of colonial extraction, not for the benefit of the local population. And yet those floods happen, and we in Britain sort of think that it's got nothing to do with us, except for the fact that our ability to live to the extent that we are able to live is directly related to their ability not to be able to live as that consequence. And we don't think that we've got a responsibility to them. We think that we might give aid or charity or sort of out of the goodness of our hearts, we might do stuff. But in part, what we're trying to do, sort of for me, that's really important is to require us to grapple with the fact that everything that enables our lives has been made possible by processes that make other people's lives not possible, and that we have a responsibility for that. And until we know that we have a responsibility for that, our frames of actions are always going to be around charity, not around redistribution. And so I think that reparative frame is a really important one for linking and putting front and center the colonial histories that enable our lives, and thinking, okay, now that we know that, what are we going to do about it?
Thank you, Govinda. Yeah, some really amazing and profound questions being asked here. I wanted to ask actually this question for Julia and Andrew, who's thinking about the early modern period, but maybe it's for everybody. So one of the things that you get in this kind of age of empires is a lot of anxiety about inter-imperial competition, and some of that anxiety about the status of your standing. Obviously evident in the Scottish case and becomes, I guess, part of the Spanish Portuguese story. And I was wondering whether inter-imperiality or inter-imperial competition produced any specific kind of dynamics or tendencies when we're thinking about these relations of extraction. And then the other question, I suppose, for also coming out of that early modern period is the extent to which imperial capitalism always depends on these fantasies of hyper-accumulation. Like you can make great riches if you invest in South Sea or East India Company, or you buy Haitian debt at discounted prices. And to what extent that fantasy of its sort of super profits continues to animate the systems that we've got now. So very kind of broad, general questions, but and maybe tangentially related to about as well. But Andrew, Julia, I don't know whether you wanted to say anything about inter-imperial.
Yeah, perhaps Andrew's better as a place to speak to the inter-imperial period, because I focus primarily on the 16th century, and in this period we have the kind of union of the crowns of Spain and Portugal. So actually, kind of this complexity of the idea of this that I kind of lost very much in my chapter. It also kind of obscures this kind of you've got this entanglement between these two crowns that then become like national crowns, Portugal and Spain, that then go on to have their separate empires that then also have to be disentangled. Tamar Herzog has written kind of quite interesting things on this, because this kind of creates all kinds of complexities to put forward in the kind of Central and South American and the global contexts. But I think that there's so much going on about the kind of regional variances across Latin America, including kind of with spheres of autonomy of indigenous communities. That's very difficult to encapsulate. And I think that actually, I kind of wanted to speak to the question over here a little bit about kind of imperial legacies, and obviously kind of like working on the 16th century and with kind of responsibility to look kind of backwards to kind of medieval legacies and forwards to kind of modern legacies and so on. It's difficult to kind of encapture all of these different things, and I guess one of the things that complicates the whole story of Latin America and its legacies is that after the colonial period, we have this kind of period of liberal reform, liberal constitutionalism that imports kind of like, very different sort of doctrines that have been developing in the earlier period, and that kind of changes the landscape in a profound way. But at the same time, there's a kind of legacy that's kind of underexplored in the kind of spheres of indigenous autonomies that exists across Latin America. That's something that I'm really interested in my own work on food sovereignty. And you're kind of thinking, what's the connection to this question? But actually, this second question that you asked about kind of the idea of wealth, well, it's something that I've been thinking about a lot. I'm working on a monograph, Empire of Poverty, the Moral Economy of the Spanish Empire. And it kind of challenges this paradox of kind of the Spanish Empire as a kind of just seemed to be an empire dripping in gold and silver that seemed to be then kind of made for. And that's why Andrew and I have a lot to talk to each other about in terms of kind of similarities between Scotland and Spain and so on. But actually, the real wealth, we've got the impact of price revolution and so on from the kind of precious metals that were extracted. But this is a kind of, the boom and bust kind of period of the mining is not really the kind of permanent source of wealth. It's the way that the agricultural production is changed. And I think that the actual kind of longer lasting legacy is kind of around this land distribution and kind of failures to reform around that, and kind of really creating the longer lasting kind of legacies of inequality that have the dialogue with also tax structures across Latin America. Thank you.
Any questions? I mean, in terms of trying to think of some of the ways in which the early modern discourses, be it Scottish or across the rest of the UK, work out, I think the Imperial won that kind of raw competition. It's interesting. British narrative tends to be one of a kind of fear of defeat, while interestingly, the domestic narrative often inside Britain is not defeat, decline, sort of moral, virtuous, and the loss of city. So there's a really interesting sort of external versus internal driven. And you're absolutely right that one of the ways in which the 18th, the early 19th century, striking how much British, never mind Scottish society, are profoundly worried that decline might come before defeat. It will be the harbinger of it. Because what you're going to do is you're going to overly develop hyper forms of luxury. All your navels are coming back. And effectively what they're doing is destabilizing society, because what they're doing is they're assets stripping large parts of the luxury-ridden Asia, but they're not just taking back capital. They're taking back the political attitudes, and essentially they are becoming, in a sense, they are sort of, in a sense, becoming like Asia. So there's a quasi-racializing of the migrant and their capital. And what's key is that by the 19th century, the early 19th century, obviously in Scotland, they're able to turn that so that the migrant then becomes good, i.e. that free movement of people out becomes a way to produce wealth, but not at decline. Does that make sense? So one of the great legacies of the early modern period, to come back to the question of legacies or thinking about lessons, is the way Britain works out. It actually likes the free movement of people on its terms, because it will produce wealth. This is an issue with trying to get the population to understand that it's certainly like the free movement of people under certain conditions out back in wealth. That change from anxiety over decline to seeing the migrant as a virtuous thing marks the end of the early modern to the point. That would be my statement.
Yeah, and presumably that also accounts for the great visibility of imperial wealth in all of our spaces, right?
Yeah, it's how they then demonstrate our work.
Right, there's all of that interpretation. Good. Any other questions? Yes, no.
Yeah, Naomi, from the Tax Justice Network, I had a journalist the other day call me up and say that she was working on a piece about how tax justice is looking in 50 years' time, and what were my thoughts on it. So I thought many things, and I said a few things off the top of my head. But I was wondering what your thoughts might be, and you know, in particular, you know, Alex was talking a bit about the 4 hours of tax, and you know, we've been doing a lot of reflecting and talking about the 5th hour of tax being reparations, and you know, how my throat's gone funny. How you would envisage 50 years' time and how that might play out in terms of reparational justice through, I guess, many different levels of tax systems that I would think about those going back again. What you might say to her.
Great, thank you, Naomi. Before I invite the panelists to reflect maybe on Naomi's question and also maybe to add any final thoughts they want, just remind you that there's a drinks reception after this. We have drinks in the Global Resource Centre on the ground floor next to the school office in C168 from 4 o'clock. So that's an incentive to continue the conversation and relax and have some fun. But yes, Naomi's question and or any final thoughts from the panel. I might start over on the right with Lila.
Yeah. When you asked that question, Naomi, the first thing that hit my mind was that 2 weeks ago, our vice president, he put up a statement on TV, and he says that now that I'm a vice president, I want to revisit the Mau Mau issue and the way in which the British colonial empire at that time, you know, dealt with them in terms of repressing them. And we have to start the conversation of reparations again. So he basically said that, and then he said he was going to have that conversation with the High Commissioner of London, who's based in Nairobi, and then he's going to report back to the public, which hasn't happened yet. So probably really reserve my comments to my vice president, said what the policy of the country is, for me to be able to think further out of this, because it's not something I really thought about. But I think 50 years from now, yeah, what will be that position? Like, what can you do to ask quickly for reparations in terms of all that extraction that has been done, that is continued to be done in the mining sector, for example, especially with the oil that we discovered, and the further implications around the East African continent as well. So that's something I really need to reflect on. I don't have the answer right now. Yeah.
Thank you. Andrew, do you want to add anything?
I won't add, I think I've spoken enough. I would simply point out that using the example of my own institution and Lady Julius, an institution which, up to a point, can argue that it has a leading role in this moving debate and reparations forward. I'm afraid I'm fairly sceptical on that and thinking about how that would happen. But the University of Glasgow is an ancient corporation. Its profits from trading and other forms were private corporatized profits. It's choosing to undertake a commendable process of reparations. I'll probably get fired for this. But I'm afraid it's doing it in ways I think very unethical. It's doing it by giving public taxpayers to our UK councils to its reparative colleagues in the University of the West Indies, and that is great. But it was a private institution that got students' reparative process not come from its war chest rather than the public part.
Julia.
So I'd say in answer to this, you know, I'm interested in the kind of intellectual and political history of poverty and poverty as a political subject, and I think the kind of the austerity regimes of kind of liberalism and then later neoliberalism have of course eroded trust in the state, and this kind of web of generalized reciprocity, as you put it, Alex, needs repairing, and I work in south of Mexico on movements around food sovereignty and kind of connections to the Via Campesina, the peasant way group across Latin America and so on. And within this kind of food sovereignty movement, which is, as I say, is linked actually in an implicit way to the kind of historic question of taxation, in that kind of land reforms or the kind of failures of land reforms have like led to this kind of different ways of articulating land access and land use movements and so on. But the kind of movement around this has really kind of been about the principle of autonomy as a kind of as creating a space in which you can kind of reproduce cultural, biological, political lives ethically, which is seen by many in like the Zapatista movement, this is a kind of obvious one, as something that needs to take place separately from the overreaching arm of the state that's going to kind of be introducing extraction, funneling wealth in particular to private companies and so on. And they've got a point, Zapatista, looking historically at the history of kind of neoliberalism in Mexico. And so I think that kind of repairing of connections and rethinking, what the state has been doing historically and its connection to empire is essential to have those kind of meaningful conversations.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to say a few words. I mean, I'm by no means a specialist of reparations or I don't specifically work on reparations, but I've been it seems like one question though that comes up a lot in the literature is on what basis might one calculate reparations, so very very concretely. And I've always wondered about the potential for for colonial tax receipts to serve as some kind of basis to measure the levels of extraction, because historians of enslavement, for instance, have been using indemnity payments to slaveholders to start calculating reparations. What if we tried using tax receipts as a basis to this? I mean, that's just a hypothesis, but it's something I was thinking about.
Right. I mean, I should what I'm going to say is like very similar to what Madeline has said, and a little bit to what's been said before. And like, first of all, information, and as precise and specific information as possible, and more of it. So whether that's in the form of like knowing, having kind of more specific information on colonial tax receipts, or if it's institutions looking at their own history and links in various different ways, and then I think like understanding more people understanding the historical context of like very current debates and issues, talking about the welfare state and death things, and actually like having the historical context of this and the and the asymmetries that go existing, being kind of more widely part of the conversations about like current directions for solving issues, and that being the kind of foundation of more discussions of this reciprocity and relinking those kinds of things. So I'll leave that.
Well, I guess I'm much more pessimistic in the sense that I think that if we don't address the reparative questions that are central to many of the things that we've heard today, we're not actually going to have a world in 50 years. The climate catastrophe is upon us. It's not about to happen, or it's here. And the sorts of questions that we're raising, I think, are intimately connected to the sorts of actions that we need to take to avert that. And so in that sense, if we're not committed to creating a world that works for all of us, where I would see reparations less about paying back what was taken and more a frame of, well, how do we create a world that works for all of us, given that that world has been created through the inequalities or through historical processes of colonialism that have produced these inequalities? What action do we now need to take for that to happen? And if we don't do that, I don't think we'll have a world in 50 years.
Yes. I also was struggling to think of what it would look like in years' time. No idea. I hope that we will, but we'll see, I guess. But I think maybe we could start thinking about, even if we don't know what it would look like, what are the things we need to do to unravel some of the harmful things going on, because like even if reparations isn't about sort of repaying past colonial receipts, like taking that and point about private corporations, that the extraction is still going, right? So if you're not just going to think about colonial receipts, you think about evidence of contemporary profit shifting or base erosion or whatever, that needs to be, even if it's not going to be repaid, it's something that needs to be undone, right? So it can't be done anymore. There's a bunch of low-hanging fruit from the world that I work on, development finance. Maybe development finance institutions could stop using low tax secrecy jurisdictions as intermediaries pending tax for development. Like low bar, right? But also, to make sure we have a world to live in aside from sort of recurrent justice, the other kind of ingredients around debt relief, debt cancellation, and finding ways to kind of invest in the future. So the majority of the world's countries are living under an austerity regime that makes it very hard to build in the future, right? And which is linked to how people deal with fiscal resources. So that would be part of whatever we do to make sure we're still here. Yes.
Thank you. Alex, the final word.
Well, Naomi is our discussing this in podcasts extraordinaire and knows better than any of us the importance of stories. That's what I think this is about. The stories that we tell ourselves are the things that speak individuality, our imaginations. If we think the world is basically fair and some places and some people are just unlucky, well, maybe some of the lucky ones will give some of the others a bit of a hand tonight. But if we think the world looks like it does because of centuries of violent extraction that continue, then the possibilities for repairing that feel different. It does matter. I really believe that. One day we may have a debt jubilee when we understand that, on a broad enough basis, the legitimacy of the debts that exist. In terms of tax, I tend to agree with them in that I don't think it's almost too much to think that we could use the history of tax as the basis for reparative payments, though I want to do that. And we can definitely do the calculation, because it's those numbers and those stories that will make possible something like what's happening at the UN now. Something that stops the crop. If we were simply paying the tax abuse now, with former colonies being the ones that lose the greatest share of their tax revenue, that would be enormously restrictive, and perhaps more than we can usually wish for already. The framing in which that happens isn't going to be one of, some guys are lucky and some weren't. It's one in which we recognise much more widely the reasons for the inequality, and nobody can legitimately say, this is just how it is. But that's so. I do think this would be the on that route.
And on that note, you should buy it. If you can't afford it because it's probably the hardback is the price of the small house, please ask your libraries to buy it, and there'll be a paper along in seconds. Thank you very much to everybody, and please do join us downstairs for a drink.